This Afromation special focuses on the issue of Black Survival 1977. We bring to you the expertise of four nationally prominent personalities: Dr. Mal Good of National Black Network News, Dr. Bertha Maxwell, chairperson of the National Council of Black Studies, Tony Brown, executive producer of Black Journal, and Dr. John Henry Clark, professor of history at Hunter College in New York. Since the American society places high priorities on time and money, we began our study of Black Survival 1977 with Mal Good, who discusses television, the most effective communications medium, the strongest social force, and one of the most lucrative enterprises in the world today. Mr. Good is considered by many to be the dean of Black professional broadcast journalism. His distinguished career in broadcasting enabled him to become the first Black hired by ABC News in New York in 1962. In 1972, he served as president of the United Nations Correspondents Association with a membership from around the world. Mal, you of all people would know what Survival 1977 means in terms of professional broadcasting. Perhaps you could tell us what Survival meant when you first started in the professional field and what it means today for us all.
Well, Survival was not too much different now, 15 years, almost 15 years later, Marianne, than it was then. Survival over the bigotry which exists in the American community. It's stronger in television and radio than in most other areas because those who are in it are jealous of it. It's a high-paying profession, especially at the network level, and there are those who feel like they hold the first priority and hold the mortgage on the air, the airwaves, and on participation of those, or rather those who take part in it. So Survival today is even more intense. The competition is there. We're at the bottom of the heap when I say we, blacks. They don't want too many women in. They don't want too many blacks in, too many minority groups, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Indians, Chicanos, what have you. This is the way of life in America, and so those young minority groups who go into it need to understand that they have a fight on their hands. As I've said so often, that it was never a day in the 10.5 years I was with ABC that something didn't come up to remind me that I was black. I have never forgotten that, and I still don't forget it. That's why I keep going and appear on programs like this when the opportunity comes to point out to those youngsters who are ambitious to understand that this is a part of their learning processes. This is a part of their training to understand that they have to fight to survive.
One of your current occupations is as a consultant to the National Black Network News. Do you see this alternative form of news reporting a viable means for a new kind of survival for blacks? And
well, for radio, and I wish there was a national black television network. In many ways, it might look as though we're discriminating against ourselves or setting us apart, but until the profession is open, until the networks open up, that would be a part of Survival, because doing the few spots that I do from week to week for the National Black Network in radio, no one questions what I say. And I say things today about South Africa and Rhodesia and the participation of the liberation forces, not the guerrillas, the freedom fighters. But I can say that on the National Black Network, which I could never have said. My desk editors, television and radio, never would have approved it. And of course, I'm sure you and your viewing public understands why. It's because of the syndrome of discrimination and bigotry, which still exists in America 1977 style. You know, Marianne, there's a great deal of talk across the country now about roots and the reaction to roots, and some say it should not have been portrayed. Some are glad they put it on white and black. They're kind of ashamed, but still it tells a great part of American history. But there's a roots syndrome existing today. It's different. You don't cut off somebody's toes to immobilize them as they did Kunta Kinte or his father. You don't strap them to a tree and whip them with a rope, but you do it psychologically and subtly. You do it to demean them in such a fashion that they'll understand they're still not equal.
And this is almost a worse kind of persecution, would you say?
Oh, without a doubt, I'd rather somebody. This is why I always enjoy going south. I know how the South operated. Well, 25, 30 years ago, it's much better today, but even in the dark days of discrimination in the South, you knew where you were. The signs were up, white and colored. But in the North, in Columbus, in Cincinnati, Cleveland, Philadelphia, my home, Pittsburgh, the great, quote, liberal city of New York, unquote, the signs were not up. But the discrimination and bigotry was a subtle kind of fashion. You talk about this profession, for example, for whatever it's worth, no particular personal pride connected with it. I was the first black to ever do a network newscast, and there are more than 250 network newscasters, men and women. There are less than 12 blacks, for two reasons. One, because of the tremendous exposure that you get to millions of people from day to day, and two, because of the kind of money that's paid. So we're limited, and you have to be 5 times better than somebody else. Last year there was a great deal of consternation, and people were upset about the appointment of somebody, a selection of somebody for $1 million a year, and she's a talented person, and I say to her, if you get $1 million, take $1 million. I would do it. But I can name a half a dozen black women, for example, in this country, in Washington, in Jacksonville, Florida, in nearby Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who can do as well as she does the best day she ever lived. But they're black. So it's going to be a long time before they ever make $1 million a year. In fact, the first black to make 100,000 will come this June when Melba Tolliver, a girl incidentally who's from nearby Akron, Ohio, who's been in radio, television about 10 years. She'll get her opportunity with one of the networks this coming June.
What would you suggest for young people coming these days to help and aid them in their attempts to survive in the broadcast world?
First thing I tell them is to prepare yourselves well, best qualifications possible. Know how to speak the English language distinctly. Drop the slang. Drop the I went down the street, you know, and I got on the bus, you know, and I came out, you know, and I come back uptown, you know. Forget that. Use the English language as well as possible to know history, to know political science, to know government. But more important, to join with the NAACP, the Urban League, those organizations that are fighting for survival of minorities, to be a part of the processes, as I said before, which deal with making opportunities equal here in this country. And that takes some doing. It's not around the corner. It isn't just over the hill. But we have to keep hammering away at it, Marianne, and not only in order to survive, but in order to make this country live up to its commitment of more than 200 years ago. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of 1787, 1788, that all men are created equal, and to prove that we have a right to participate in the mainstream of the American government like anybody else, because we had some input in the development and the building of this country that goes back many more generations than most of those who are here, except the Indian, that we helped to build. When I say we, I mean black Americans helped to build this country and make it what it is, and we didn't give it, they took it. 244 years of labor, free labor, for which we got nothing in return. And now asking to share in it, I don't think is too much, and I don't think I ought to beg for it, nor my children, nor my grandchildren. I just want to be a part of it. In fact, as long as I live, I'm going to insist that I'm a part of it, because I witness it everywhere I go. And these 2 days here in Columbus has indicated to me that there's a plantation kind of syndrome even in this so-called great city. And they'll probably cut this out of your interview, Marianne, but on this campus of 55,000 students and 4,500 members of the faculty, and less than 100 members of the faculty are black, and 5,000 students, and many of them merely tolerated here, just tolerated, and small percentage of them that finish, and athletes that participate in the programs here, many of them don't graduate, never get degrees, they're just used for their periods of eligibility. It's not only true here, it's true at my alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh, 100 miles, 184 miles from here. It ought not be in 1977 under any circumstances. So the leadership here is guilty. The leadership in Pittsburgh The leadership in that jungle I come from, called New York City, is as guilty as it can be, black and white leadership, that they allow these conditions to obtain in 1977.
I would like to ask you about your feeling about survival around the world in a context. You've worked many years at the United Nations on that particular beat, and you've traveled immensely, and you've had an opportunity to get a feel for what the world populace is thinking and feeling. Where's the energy level?
Well, I really don't worry too much about what the Soviet Union or Poland thinks about us, but we need to give it some consideration because our stature around the world has gone down considerably, despite the fact that we've given away billions of dollars trying to buy friendship. It's gone down tremendously in recent years, primarily because of the race problem in this country and our failure to deal forthrightly with it. And so we need to understand the world's getting smaller and smaller by the hour because of communications and because of improved methods of travel. And if we're going to be only 6%, we're only 6% of the world's population. If we're going to be influential in the world in the days to come, we're going to have to deal primarily with this problem. We're going to have to eliminate hunger and poverty and want in the richest land in the world. And we're going to have to do away with the old simple problem like you not hating me or me not hating you or me hating you, you hating me, because I go to a different church, because I'm Jew or Catholic or Protestant or black or Indian, whatever it may be. It's a lot of nonsense because no one holds any special priority on equality in this country. This country was built by lots of people and has been a great country, but it's not going to be a great country long unless we recognize this very serious problem, which is gnawing away at us like a cancer. It's kind of like Dr. William Sloane Coffin said a couple of years ago, Marianne, when assessing this thing, when he said America's in not only an economic recession, but in a moral depression. And America needs to pay herself a visit and hope she finds herself at home, to look square in the mirror at herself and say, these conditions ought not obtain, and we're going to change it. We have the power and the ability to make those changes if we decide to do it.
And do we have the money?
Oh, too much money. Our gross national product is more than a quadrillion dollars today. It has grown from $500 billion in 1961 when President Kennedy took office. We are only 6% of the world's population. Our gross national product is greater than the combined gross national product of 136 of the 147 member countries of the United Nations. So we can do whatever we want to do. We had $58 billion to spend to go to the moon, to come back with some rocks and some pictures. We've never been able to justify it since it happened 7 or 8 years ago. If we could do that, if we could go to the moon, and we could find some way to extend the overflow of the snows this spring out to the arid regions of the West, we can certainly solve a simple problem like getting along together. And we need to use 4 basic words in our vocabulary from day to day. We need each other. It's just that plain and just that simple.
According to Dr. Bertha Maxwell, effective educational programs to combat the psychological assault on black people are necessary to aid in the struggle for survival. Black Studies departments nationwide are vigilant in this effort. The Black Studies Department of The Ohio State University hosted the first annual convention for the National Council for Black Studies. The theme of the conference was Black Studies Mobilization for Survival. In the following interview, Dr. Bertha Maxwell, chairperson of the National Council for Black Studies, discusses the necessity of formalized Black Studies programs in the survival of our people. Dr. Maxwell, do you feel that the National Council for Black Studies is one of those organisms that is necessary at this time for the survival of black people?
Marianne, I certainly do, and I think that that's my reason for being here today, for my willingness to commit myself to work for this organization and its survival, because number one, I am concerned about the survival of black people. And in formulating this infant organization, I think the thing that has caused my involvement, which I think breeded the commitment that I have, comes from the fact that at this particular time I feel that we are, as black people, very, very vulnerable in this society. I feel that when we talk about this organization, we're talking about an organization that is made up of people, of black people who are concerned with this whole process of education. And I think that this group is perhaps very unique in as much as we are dealing with this educational process of black people. We're talking about the mind. That is the most important part of the human spirit anyway, or the human being. What goes into this process of education which will enable us to survive. And I think that...
How are you defining survival in 1977 for black people?
Well, I'm not talking about merely a physical survival. I'm talking about all 5 dimensions of the personality development of a human being, which makes him functional in this society. And I think that as a basis of not only the organization but education itself, we must understand that we're the survival of the mind, the intellectual survival. And I think that out of the desegregation that has occurred, that something drastic is happening to black people in this country. I don't think that there is nearly the awareness of what's going on with our kids from kindergarten through high school, at the college level, and I think that this organization can kind of create that kind of awareness as to what's happening to black people in education as it's institutionalized in this country. And I think that another thing that we have to be concerned about in institutionalized education is the fact that it's not only to just black kids, white kids also. I think that what you find happening, you have undereducation for black kids, you have miseducation for white kids. So you put that together and you have a very, very explosive element that's embedded in this whole institution called education.
I'm very interested in your concept of education for black studies departments or ethnic studies programs, all of which I think fall under the rubric of the National Council of Black Studies.
Okay, I think that there's one thing that we have to separate out, and that's this of ethnic studies, because I think that that's why we have this, we've named ourselves the National Council for Black Studies. I think you start to dilute the whole movement when you bring in ethnic studies, because we are concerned about people of other ethnic origins, but our primary and prioritized list of concerns at this particular time is that of the survival of black studies. And when we talk about black studies, we're talking about the educational process from kindergarten until death, if that's what you want to, in terms of how the educational process would go for a human being. So we're not talking about just education in traditional higher education with black studies. We're talking about the programs that we find in communities that is concerned about the survival of black people.
This was the question I wanted to ask, was when you think of black studies, are you speaking merely of the institutionalized process, or are you concerned with the total involvement within the black community of the educators?
We are concerned with the total involvement of all people who are concerned about the educational process of black people. And whether it's a Sunday school teacher, a mother, or whether it's a professor at a university, or whether we're talking about a high school teacher. So we're talking about all of those people who are genuinely concerned about the educational process for black people. And I think that that is why you have such a unique organization known as the National Council for Black Studies, because we're not concerned with just scholars talking with scholars. What good will that do when you still have the mass or the greatest majority of the people still locked into cycles of poverty, where they are undereducated, miseducated. So therefore we have to find ways in which we can draw this mass of people into the whole educational process. Not just a hit and miss kind of a thing, and I think that this is the uniqueness of this organization. Now, it's much easier to put a handle on this where you have black studies programs are organized in higher education. However, I think that we have to communicate and coordinate all of our efforts so that it's not so fragmented. And I think that this is what the problem has, what we faced, or what we see as a problem, especially in the South, down South. not
Down home.
south. Because you
Down
see,
home.
I don't really think that there's too much difference in attitudes and behavior, especially when we talk about institutional racism. And the real problem as it relates to the educational process for black people, we're dealing with a very mammoth kind of an institution that grew out of the institution of slavery, which was institutional racism. And I think that when you create that kind of, and you know that that awareness is being created through the educational process, that you make students aware of this as a part of their educational process, it prepares them for survival. And I think that as a philosophical base for any Black Studies program, you must build into that philosophy of survival. I don't care whether it's at kindergarten, whether it's at high school, or whether it's at the college or graduate programs. You must build into that how to cope in this, with this thing called institutional racism. How do you cope with that for your survival?
How do you cope with it within the institution is what I want to ask.
Well,
I mean, for Black Studies departments and programs.
That is a problem. In our educational process, we have not been trained to cope with it. We've either, I think there's been for so long, Marianne, we tried to rationalize this thing away. I think that we tried to say, okay, if I can become as white as the white person who is the majority in this country and in control of the institution of education, and the more we can be like, I think Russell Adams said, the ducks in the pond, then the more I will be accepted. Well, see, that's a misnomer. And if we educate our kids towards assimilation into something that is not going to ever be in my lifetime, your lifetime, or our children's lifetime, then I think that is miseducation. So what we have to do is, first of all, to provide in our educational process that you are what you are. You are a Black American. Now, accept that, live with that, then learn how to work in the institution to the point that you're not educated away from that. Because for so long, for you to wear a natural, you know, that would be unheard of. And that whole process went along in our educational process from your, not perhaps your grandparents, but mine, certainly. That, okay, if your hair is smooth and the more you look like white people, the more you act like white people, then you're going to be accepted, you see. But that misnomer, I think, disappeared during the 60s. I think that when the kids started to come out and could be natural like what I see you being, then that process started to go back to some things that existed in the whole process of education for Black people for a long time. I think there was a greater awareness brought forth during the 60s. And I think that that kind of consciousness of accepting ourselves as being what we are is a survival or a coping skill.
Out of the 60s came the many Black Studies departments per se. Now we are in a period of retrenchment, needless to say, in terms of the funds and resources for Black Studies programs. Is the very survival of these programs at stake?
I think so, because anytime you go into an economic depression, and I think it's based on economics, after all, you have a discipline that I think if you put it out around the entire country, you're not going to find but a few places, if you find it, really accepted there. The first thing that's going to be chopped off will be this legitimate academic endeavor, which has not received the sanction of universities as a legitimate academic discipline, because most of the programs grew out of the discontent of the 60s. And so it was just kind of a, let's make an instant stir and mix instant academic discipline.
Pacification.
Yes. And so you see, that was just, okay, this is just a fad. It'll pass away. But you see, that's a misnomer. This is indeed, Black Studies, you will find, is indeed a legitimate academic endeavor. It has a very strong philosophical base, in my opinion, at least the program that we developed at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. The first philosophical base for that legitimate academic discipline is that of survival as a person, the survival of our history, which is very, very important to Black people, to know something about who we are. You see, because and how can we deal with institutional racism unless we know how institutional racism in this country was breeded or born out of slavery? Once we know the essence of that through this process, this educational process of knowing this, making it the essence of what we are, then we can better maintain our survival.
Knowing, accepting, and moving along.
And acting on it.
And acting on it.
And acting on it. We have to stop trying to fool ourselves that we are going to really be assimilated into this society. We have to plug in where we are without compromising our principles, without saying that, okay, I will just go along with status quo. We have to struggle for what it is that we need in order to survive and pass that along to our brothers and sisters who are locked in the ghettos.
Do you think that the philosophical basis of survival, which your program at in Charlotte, the University of North Carolina, and also the one at the Ohio State University, I would like to say, is the widespread basis on which most of the Black Studies departments or programs are founded in the National Council for Black Studies?
I'm not certain, and I think that that's why we're here, is because we want to look at programs across the country. And I think that this is the first opportunity that we've had for people who are engaged in this endeavor to do that. I think that the format of our program will attest to that. As we talk to scholars or we talk to directors of programs from California or New Mexico, we can start to look at and assess and evaluate our programs in light of that particular philosophical concept. Now, I don't know. That's why we have the council coming together now. And I think that that's what we're trying to build into our structure, some means of evaluating our programs ourselves so that we don't have to look outside and have someone come in and say, oh, no, that's not a legitimate academic endeavor. Because I think that we are the ones who must validate what we are, define what we are, structure what we are, and that we follow this kind of thing, analyze what this whole thing is about, synthesize it, bring it back together, evaluate it constantly. And I think that the mechanism of the National Council for Black Studies can be about those things.
Tony Brown was also a participant in the first annual conference for the National Council for Black Studies. Mr. Brown, former dean of the School of Communications at Howard University, is currently the executive producer and host of Black Journal, which is in its 9th season. In the following interview, we learned that Mr. Brown feels that survival means the pursuit of simple justice. His personal contribution is working for the projection of the Black presence in the media. Tony, I would like to ask you what your conception of survival 1977 for Black people is and means.
Well, I think in the 50s, Black people were basically involved in civil rights, and I think that Black people taught America civil rights. In the 60s, Black people were accused of having an alleged revolution. It was a social revolution, but never a violent revolution. So we brought that concept to America. In the 70s, Black people gestated. We gave birth with roots, and we gave a new direction. And in the 80s, I believe that Black people will carry Blacks who are not ready and whites who are not ready into the quest for full justice and simple justice, which I think is where we're all headed, or where all of us should be headed.
What does full justice and complete justice mean?
Well, simple justice is what we all have coming to us. It means that you're not right because you're Black, and you're not wrong because you're white, and you're not right because you're white, and you're not wrong because you're Black. It simply means that people who are qualified are going to find out that they're going to be the leaders, whether they're Black or white. And some of us who are Black have to finish the Black bath, and I hope we do it before December 31st, 1979, so that we can go into January 1st, 1980, in the quest of simple justice. I'm not talking about integration. I'm not talking about being with white people. I'm talking about understanding that the Black presence is a universal presence, and we can't continue to define it as a presence of psychological ghettoizing ourselves into thinking the Black experience is unique to the human experience. But I don't think the purpose of the Black presence is to educate the white presence or to educate whites about the Black presence.
There's a presence, and then there's survival, and then there's survival with joy. How would you characterize those three stages in terms of, or the latter two you've characterized?
I don't know
the
that
first.
I understand that statement well enough to describe it, but I can put it in another context. And that is, we share, Blacks, share time and space with white people. Neither group has ever in this country wanted to admit, whites still do not want to admit, that Black history in America is American history. And Blacks reacting to that rejection somehow don't want to admit that we're going to share time and space with whites. And that's the lesson we have to learn. Survival depends on interdependence. We now want to believe that we can create a black presence and a white presence unrelated to the other presence. And if we don't, we're not going to survive. And any other discussion and any other perspective of discussion of survival is always going to fall short until we go back and approach that basic foundation.
So you're working for a human family in your own work in the media with Black
I'm
Journal?
working for the projection in the media of the black presence so that it can bring some pride and understanding to black people so that black people can basically do what we have to do in order to be empowered. I am not doing it to educate whites to give anything to blacks. Blacks cannot have anything given to them. The freedom of black people is the responsibility of black people. We cannot be given freedom. We must work for freedom. No people, conversely, can enslave us if we have the tools, the knowledge, the understanding necessary to be a free people. So once we acquire power through this quest for freedom and justice and truth, we will obviously and naturally orient or bring about an equality in justice with whites. I don't really believe that whites have an investment, as some blacks believe, in keeping us out of power. I don't believe that. I believe that it's a historical situation that has to be corrected, but the oppressed must do basically the correction.
You talk about the quest for freedom, justice, and truth. How about bread and butter?
Well, bread and butter intertwine. You can't have one without the other. You can't have bread and butter unless the federal government has adopted a social policy to deliver services to you. Or you're just talking about something that is out of touch with reality. We can have black conferences, and we can discuss what each of us is going to do for, quote, survival, for bread and butter, but we can't have it if the federal government has a social policy of benign neglect in which the climate itself deprives people who are black and white of simple justice. And I think maybe that's one of the things I disagree with some black scholars on, and that is that I think we have to approach the climate and change the climate before we can individually change or bring about change within in this environment. The climate under President Carter will be more conducive to our survival, yet President Carter cannot help us survive. It will simply be a climate that is less restrictive to our needs, quote, i.e. survival, than the previous two Republican administrations.
You say President Carter cannot help us survive. Do you mean by that we ourselves must do that, or why don't
Yes,
we quite understand that?
I mean that President Carter cannot be the great white father to black people.
Mm-hmm.
President Carter cannot deliver black people. President Carter can work to create a climate in which blacks and whites in this country understand simple justice. And in that climate, it is more conducive and it will be easier for us to survive.
What kinds of specific steps would you think need to be taken to bring about the simple justice and survival, if we can equate those two?
Yes, well, I think one, that basically it's a matter of personal perspective on the part of black people. I think one, if we can adopt as a premise that the freedom of black people is the responsibility of black people, and that if we can understand that we have to be black but not as a reaction to being white, and I think that if we can understand that we have to have, finally, a country in which we share time and space with everybody else in it based on simple justice, that all of our other concerns will fall into place. I frankly think sometimes we make too much out of survival. We are experts at survival. I really don't like to go to conferences and discuss survival. The history of black people in this country is a textbook on survival. I think some of us are a little paranoid, a little myopic even maybe, on this subject of are we going to survive? Of course we're going to survive. We are a people of winners. It's just a matter of how and what quality of life we're going to have.
Yes, that's the reason I added a few sentences back about survival with joy. I wonder how do we do that?
Well, we have always done it. We are not poor because we've been identified as poor. We're only poor if our perception of our existence sees a poor person. And I don't agree with this. We're down and out and we're downtrodden. That's Moynihan's poison. We're not. We never have been. We've always survived with joy. It doesn't mean that you have to have money to have joy. It doesn't mean that you have to own the plantation to have joy. It doesn't mean you have to go to college to have joy. It's your perception of yourself based on the way that you see yourself as a dignified person. If joy is the appropriate word, it gives you joy.
Giving joy, creating joy. Do you think that is one of the essences of survival, or do you think that is a whole redundant issue as you think survival itself
I think
is?
it's a redundant issue. I don't think giving joy is the issue at all. I don't think receiving joy is the issue at all.
What
I
is
think,
the issue in life then for black people?
I think the issue in life for black people is the same as the issue in life for white people. And I think black people are basically like white people. Most of us are average, a few of us are geniuses, and we have a whole lot of fools, both blacks and whites. I don't see any difference in blacks and whites. I think that all of us came here basically to leave the world a little better than we found it. And I think that blacks and whites are experts at being fools, because somehow we think that we came here for a black bath and whites think they came here for a white bath. And I don't think until the two of us get that ignorance out of ourselves. And I'm not talking about integration. I do not believe in busing, and integration is something that I'm not interested in. I'm interested in equality. I will still want to prefer to be with black people. I'll still prefer my own ethnicity. But I do not want it, and it cannot be something that will be viable if the society itself is not based on simple justice.
How do you feel you are able to bring about some of these enlightening steps in your work?
I do the best I can. I seek the truth to the best of my ability on a daily basis. I understand that I am far short of being a wise person, but hopefully a student of wisdom. I am interested in using the medium for something other than football, basketball, tap dancing, and singing. And I think somewhere along the line, something I do in the media will touch someone, and I hope that that someone is a human being.
Are you using the human being in a special sense, or?
No, I'm using it in a human sense. I'm not that concerned that the human being be black.
Oh, I see.
I'm concerned that the person have a human approach to life.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the history of Black Journal, as you have worked with
Well,
it.
I don't know if we got time to talk about the history of Black
Well,
Journal.
briefly,
Well, it's
maybe we
9
can-
years old, and it started in 1968, and it's evolved in a number of ways, and it's changed a number of times. Its approach has basically been the same, and that's the black presence.
I asked that question because for a television program, a black television program, or any television program, if you wish to put it in that context, to survive for 9 years is in itself an accomplishment. That is why I asked that particular question.
Well, I think one can survive if they see a television program in the context of society rather than something that's set aside and placed in media. We've never just been a television program. We've always been something that meant more to our constituents than just turning on the knob. We've always related to the black community in a very special way. We never stayed away from them. We've been involved with the black newspapers outside of the television program, with black organizations. We've tried to voice different sectors of the black community's concerns. We've approached the black community not on a monolithic basis, but on the fact that we know that you're a black woman. You have concerns about being black that I don't have. In that context, I'm a black man. We're both black, but I have concerns about a man's role that you don't have. Black children and students have specialized. We don't say they're black people. Let's sit and tell all black people. We've tried to reflect the differences in us as a group of people based on our demographic differences. And I think that's one of the things. We've touched the bases, I'm saying. Not all the bases. Everybody black doesn't like Black Journal, never has and never will. And we've never been naive enough to expect that either.
Well, do you think that's even necessary?
No, I don't. I do think it's necessary to reach somebody at a certain level, and I think that in the last 2 years, I wrote a little piece last year that white people now were ready for Black Journal. This year with Roots has demonstrated that white people are now ready for the black presence. And I think that now we have to gear up and go at it another way in the post-Roots era. That one, a black program has to adopt that the education of black people is its major objective, and that the education of white people is its secondary objective. 5 years ago, I would not have said that. 5 years ago, white people were not educable in terms of the black presence. Now they are, because we've changed white people. And because white people have changed, they have changed us.
You speak of the black presence. That's a very interesting term. Haven't the black people always been present, but hasn't the problem been that we have been invisible?
No, we've never been invisible.
I mean, in the invisible man concept.
Well, the invisible man is simply a play on words or something borrowed from fiction. But we are and have always had a presence. We were the reason for the Civil War. How can anybody say that we were invisible if the country was torn apart over us? Segregation was devised for us. Discrimination had us in mind. Benign neglect was created out of a concern for black people. The entire society has defined itself as a reaction to black people. White men define their masculinity relative to a black man's masculinity. And white women define their sexuality in reference to a black woman's sexuality. How can anybody say we don't have presence? That's presence. Now, the fact that someone attempts to ignore you is their problem. I know I'm in this seat, whether or not you want to admit it or not. You know, if you don't think I'm here, you have the problem. I don't. And I'm not going to let you give me your problem. We are, in this country, if you look at the 3 major programs in the top 11 that have had the greatest audiences in the history of television, Roots has 8 in the top 10. Gone with the Wind has, I think, 3rd place. And the 10th place is Super Bowl 76. All 3 of those programs is about black people. Gone with the Wind is about the Civil War being fought over blacks. The Super Bowl is black programming. Most of the football players are black. And obviously Roots was about a black family. So what is it psychologically? If we can understand that the major events on television have all been about the black presence, then there's something psychological in the minds of whites in this country about us, and that gives us a presence. I think some of us perhaps believe that whites believe we're invisible. I think whites are so preoccupied with us that they've attempted to make themselves believe that we were invisible.
What is the term for that psychologically, in the psychological jargon?
I think it's called repression.
Repression? Just repression?
Well, it's, you know, denial. They're both low-level defense mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. But it's a high-level goal.
What is
the repression and because it's trying to wipe out a whole people.
No, I don't believe that.
No?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That's attributing to whites a conspiratorial motive. Racism is not a conscious conspiracy. Racism is an emotional disease. It's a neurosis. There is a greater investment in the problem than in the cure. It's a sickness. And some of us blacks want to approach racism in a rational sense. We're really talking about prejudice and discrimination. If we really ever get out and talk about racism, we'll talk about it in the context of a pathology. That's what it is. It's not a conspiracy. No 2 schizophrenics have ever gotten together and planned to conspire against the world. They become schizophrenic in an atmosphere that is pathological, respective atmospheres.
Dr. John Henry Clark is an internationally acclaimed historian who is presently teaching at Hunter College in New York. Dr. Clark is an essayist, editor, and anthologist. He has written extensively on topics ranging from the study of Harlem and Malcolm X to Marcus Garvey and Africa. He feels that the question of survival is actually a question that has been asked throughout history by the black peoples of the world. How will my people stay on this earth? Dr. Clark, what do you think is the difference in survival 1977 for black people as opposed to survival in prior years?
I think the difference mainly is in how it is expressed. It is more vocal now. People are more assertive now. But the survival has always been a part of our very existence and the way to survive. And our writers have always tried to ask and answer the question, how will my people stay on this earth? And that is the major question that the writer and the intellect and the teacher is responsible for asking, and he's also responsible for seeking out an answer of how will we stay on the earth.
Is it possible for the writer to find this kind of an answer, or must each individual do this for himself?
Each individual will do for himself as best he can, but if people have people classified as intellects, classified as teachers, classified as writers, it is incumbent upon them to take the most serious try at finding that answer. Not that each individual must not try to find it for himself, but the collective answer should nearly always be assigned to those who, by virtue of training and by virtue of experience, and I'm not talking about formal training in a school, by virtue of trying to do it, have come up with something closest to the answer.
Your answers that you have been collecting for years and have been sharing with us the answers of the past. Do you think that they are more viable solutions than what some of the answers that are brought forth today?
I use the past only to the extent that it is relevant in the present and it helps to shape the future. I am a teacher of history, and I know and I try to get across to students that all history is a current event, and everything that man has ever done will influence all man for all times. So there are old examples with current uses, depending on where you pull those answers and how you explain the answer. Now, if I look at African people worldwide, historically,
Yes.
I can draw an answer an example 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But the major reoccurring defect in our history as a people is our inability to make an assessment of the people that we are associating with, people who came from outside of the family. And we have been overly generous to strangers. And you can go back to the first invasion of Africa in 1675 BC to the conference about Rhodesia or Zimbabwe in Geneva. And the same mistake is being made. And that mistake is that you never, absolutely never, invite an outsider into a family dispute. Those Africans had no business in Geneva negotiating the destiny of their nation with a thief. No more than they had any business giving a rabbit some lettuce and carrots for safekeeping in a brow patch. So people must think out their own priorities in relationship to the interplay of powerful forces in the world. And I think this is our political dilemma, and it has always been our political dilemma. And if you look at the blacks in the Portuguese area, the Portuguese-dominated areas in Africa, who politically were supposed to be the most backward, and yet they made the most forward stand in that liberation. They didn't argue the point. They didn't go to conference and beg the issue. They found out that if I'm going to be free, then I must be the instrument of my own liberation. And they found the means, and they liberated themselves. And they didn't ask that they be accepted as independent people. They proclaimed
That they
were independent people.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about black people being too generous or African peoples being too generous, do you think part of this is rooted in our religious heritage?
Part of it is rooted in your religious heritage, and part of it is rooted in the structure of the kind of society that produced you. You came out of a society where people nearly always had enough to eat, enough to wear, and enough land to till. And when you come out of a society where nature is kind, you can afford to be kind because some of this is in your personality. You can afford to invite people for dinner, perfect strangers, because you've got plenty dinner. But when you came out of a thawed-out icebox in northern Asia that was later called Europe, where nature was stingy and where the land was taken over by a few men at the expense of the many, creating feudalism, and where large masses of people were at the mercy of strong, small groups of people. Something of this environment gets into your personality, something of meanness, something of competitiveness. Now, this is not a racial thing. This is an environmental thing based on your reaction to the environment that produced you.
You insist that it's not a racial thing.
No, no. I said, you put the African down in that same stingy climate, he might develop some of the same characteristics if he's there long enough. See, but the African did not have to compete with his brother for his breakfast, and his wife, and his water, and his land.
But you do not, of course, I say of course liberally, you do not deny the effects of racism though today,
Oh, no.
or the reality
No,
of that
racism
today.
is as prevalent as the wind and the rain today, especially in the Western world. But the racism that we are dealing with, let's make sure that we understand where to pick up its chronology. We pick up its chronology in the 15th and the 16th century. And we separate racism from prejudice. Prejudice has always been with us. But Western racism, based on color, developed out of the slave trade and the colonial system. That racism is still with us, and it goes across all political and organizational lines. And it breaks the heart of many of my brothers who are Marxist Leninists to be told that this kind of racism does not stop at the door of communism and socialism. If the European is clear on one thing, he's clear on the decision that he made with the cooperation of the church in the 15th and the 16th century. That is, whosoever controls the world is going to be one of us. Now, the style has changed, but the intent has not changed.
Have our survival mechanisms also changed with the style of the oppression?
Our survival mechanisms have changed, but not changed enough. We are, and it's good to understand this, we are a Messiah-prone people, overly sentimental, very ceremonious, who many times create in our mind what we want in reality without understanding that this does not apply to the people that we have to deal with. It is absolutely foolish to appeal to a colonialist on the basis of Christianity, although he says he's a Christian and says he's teaching you Christianity. But he could not hold power using the rules of Christianity because his very presence in your country as your master is against Christianity and against democracy too. Now, we have a hard time distinguishing between words and action. So therefore, we cannot many times internalize the job that is before us. The achievement of the Africans in the Portuguese-dominated area, that they can make an assessment of the situation, internalize what they had to do, and systematically go ahead and do it. So this man who has controlled my country, violated my women, robbed me of my resources, is my enemy. And I don't care how many times he calls himself a Christian, so long as he holds sway over my life, he is my enemy.
Unequivocally.
And that is what I have to deal with. Now, he deals with me with a gun, and that is how I'll have to deal with him. Now, the fact that the African is a Christian and the man he must kill is a Christian may be another thing, but the African understands the nature of his understanding of Christianity and the nature of the understanding of his enemy. Not all Africans, but the specific Africans that I am talking about. Now, in Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe, called Rhodesia after this British thief, Cecil Rhodes, in this country, more and more Africans are understanding that the Christianity that the Europeans literally palmed off on them is not only not being practiced by the Europeans, but they couldn't possibly hold power and practice it. If they practiced it for 24 hours, they would get off their backs.
Yes.
And that they violate the very religion which they said that they're teaching the Africans. Now, I do not acknowledge the European as the creator of Christianity. I know that Christianity is older than Europe, and that Christianity, as we know it, was born during the Roman domination of North Africa and Western Asia, and that the Romans killed people and burned them at the stake for being Christian for over 200 years before they decided to stop killing Christians and become Christians. Then they made Christianity a political instrument and the handmaiden to rationalize their world power, their first period. Then they went into the so-called Dark Ages, and they came out of it through the Crusades. Then when they mastered maritime skill and began to put their boats again on the sea of the world, now with long voyages, and began to search in Asia and Africa, first for spices, not slaves, but for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. Then after that, the slave trade.
And after that, a whole new period.
A whole new period
of
in the life
survival
of man,
for black people.
That survival for black people specifically, but the survival and the lack of survival for people called the Caribs and Arawaks in the West Indies. Now, there were up to 12 million people of so-called Indians in the West Indies. There is not one person alive who can say for certain he's a direct descendant of an Arawak or a Carib. Now, an entire people were destroyed to accommodate the coming of the European and the settlement of the European in this part of the world. And because these so-called Indians died so fast, they had to look for a new labor supply. Then, and only then, did they turn toward Africa. They had new guns, new trinkets, and they began to arbitrate African family disputes and began to conquer both sides of the family, first the one who invited them into the argument. And now the whole new world exploration was underway, and the world would never, absolutely never, be the same again. So it was not just the survival of the blacks, although that was paramount, but it was the survival of the Asians also.
This Afromation special focused on the issue of Black Survival, 1977. Our guests were Dr. Mal Good from the National Black Network News, Dr. Bertha Maxwell, chairperson of the National Council for Black Studies, Tony Brown, executive producer of Black Journal, and finally, Dr. John Henry Clark, who is a professor of history at Hunter College in New York. We hope that you have enjoyed the program this evening, and that if you have any questions or comments, that you will write them to Afromation, 2400 Olentangy River Road, Columbus, Ohio. Also, we encourage you to be listening to our weekly radio program, the Black Studies Broadcast Journal, which is on every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. on WOSU AM radio. Thank you very much for being with us.